Thank you so much. Thank you. You're too kind. It is a great joy for me to be here, one of our sister churches, and one with a great reputation all over the country. I wanted to share a piece from a book that I read this year, probably the best book I've read all year, called Give and Take by Adam Grant. A friend of mine said, you got to read this book. It's kind of a business book. It's not a Christian book, but it talks about the three kinds of people in every organization. You have them in your church, in your business, in your home, on your sports team: givers, takers, and matchers. And everyone in the room, you're one of those three. You're a giver, taker, or a matcher. And it's hard to tell sometimes people who work with you if they're a giver, taker, or matcher, because all of us give and all of us take. So what Adam Grant does, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version, you don't have to read the book. What Grant does is says you have to look at people's motives, which will determine who they give to. So a giver is motivated by investing. And so we've got parents invest in their kids, coaches invest in athletes, teachers invest in students. And if you have people at your work that give time, attention, or even gifts to people below them in the organization, you know that they are motivated by investing. Because you give to people below you because they are the ones you that can most successfully invest in with the greatest profitability. Takers, on the other hand, and about 25%, nobody wants to be a taker, but about 25% of you are. Takers can be just as generous with time and money, but they don't give down, they give up. So they will give lots of overtime to their boss. They'll give lots of compliments to salespeople that they want to get their business. They will give even lots of money to clients that they think they can get their business from. You've seen those people in your work? None of us wants to be a taker, but a lot of people are. They're driven by achievement or advancement. So I give above so that ultimately I will get back from the people above me. Now takers, or matchers, they're interesting. 54% of us are matchers. So in this room, over half are matchers. We tend to give laterally because what we're most concerned about is justice, fairness. If I give you something, I expect you to give me something. So at the Christmas party, they want to know, how much are we spending on the gift? If you don't give me the same level of gift, I'm upset. Or if I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I helped you on a project, why don't you help me? So if they don't get reciprocation equally, they really get bent out of shape. Now in the church, we have givers, takers, and matchers. And people who give in the church give for different motives. Here's where it becomes kind of dangerous. If you have a taker in the church, they're giving above, either to God or to a preacher, because they want a building named after them, or they want a certain program developed, or they want a certain style of music. If they don't get what they want, they're out the back door really mad because I gave and I didn't get in return. Matchers are the same way. And you got to be careful. If you honestly say, yeah, I'm a matcher, you got to be careful because when you give in the church, if they have a style of music you don't like, well, I gave. They should give back to me. Or I want this certain program, or I want my club to be able to meet in the church. And if you get a no, you will typically go out the back door with gossip on your lips. It's givers that really give to God well. And that's what I want to talk about today. But even if you're not a Christian, maybe you're a pre-Christian or a post-Christian, you came today, I want to give you something that you can walk out with because this will be really helpful. If you hire in your business, if you coach a team, if you're a parent, or if you're a manager at where you work, you will be really interested in Adam Grant's research. 30,000 people he investigated and did questionnaires with. Here's what he found. At the top of every organization, there's a level of people, they just rise higher than everybody else. And at the bottom of every organization, there are people that just gravitate towards failure. You know it's true. High performers, low performers. Would you guess that the lowest performers, and it doesn't matter what sector you're in, what business, military, accounting, whatever, every organization is the same. The lowest performers in every organization, would you guess that they are givers, takers, or matchers? They are givers. And that's not what you wanted me to say, but you know why it's true. Because we all know that person, they give and give and give and give, and they don't have boundaries. So they get burned out. They invest in people who are a bad investment, and they just get disgusted with them over time. So givers tend to be the lowest performers in any organization. Let's turn it around. Who do you think are the highest performers in any organization, any sector? Who would you guess? They are givers. Givers are disproportionately represented at the top and at the bottom of every organization. Again, you're smart people, you know why. People who give over time with appropriate boundaries. They let enough people get what they need, they always get what they want. It's just a rule of life. If you help enough people over time get what they need, you will always get what you want. So if you're hiring, hire givers. They will always make your organization better. If you're a coach, put givers on the playing field. They will always make the team better. If you're in a church, recruit givers, because they will always make everybody else around them better if they give in a good way. And the Bible talks about givers who are takers and givers who are matchers and givers who are good givers. And because your pastor is nationally recognized as one of the best teachers on stewardship, I know you know the answer to this question. What is the Bible's word, starts with a T, for good givers? It is tithers. So tithing, and I want to illustrate this to make sure we're all on the same page. Here we have 10 $100 bills. I know you're curious. Yes, they're real. $1,000 up on the stage. So we know that a tithe is 10%, right? So these bills represent, each one represents 10% of the $1,000. And you know, I assume you know, that tithe, according to the Bible, is for the local church. So giving to other organizations is not bad, but it's not a tithe. It's when you bring it to the storehouse of God. So we've got that. But let me ask you a question. Which of these bills represents the tithe? Number one. Now, some of you are going, well, what does it matter? Because number 8 is 10%, and number 5 is 10%, and number 10 is 10%. Why does it matter? Well, let me show you why. If I give this $100 bill, that is not a tithe. That's a tip. Because a tip is what you give after the meal is served. A tip is what you give after the bellhop has helped you with your bags. And a tip says, thank you for serving me. A tithe, completely different message. A tithe says, I pledge to serve you. Tips show appreciation. Tithe shows allegiance. If I give a tithe, who owns the other 9? God. If I give a tip, who owns the other 9? Me. And that's why tithing is so effective as a mechanism for giving. It's not the dollar amount. It's not even the percentage. It is what this tithe says to God about your resources. God, I'm going to give this to you so that all the other 9, I'm showing allegiance to you as Lord. This is not my money, it's your money. It's not, and the thing is, when you give money like this, it also affects your marriage. Because when you give the first 10% of your resources, then you say, God, all the rest, that's yours. In fact, my car is yours, my house is yours, my marriage is yours, my kids are yours. And when you become a person who gives allegiance to God, you actually become a better parent, a better spouse, a better worker, and a better Christian. And you're thinking, well, you know, you're talking about giving because the church wants something from me. No, the church wants something for you. Let me be really clear with you. 28% of tithers, 28% are completely debt-free. They don't have a house payment, they don't have a car payment, they don't have a credit card payment. Let me ask you this. Is that what you want for you? Would you love to be like, I owe nothing to anyone except to God? That's where all of us want to be. Tithing is not what you give to the church, it's what God wants you and what you want for you. 80% of people who are tithers have no car payment. Wouldn't that be cool? And yet 80% of all tithers make no car payment. I haven't had a car payment in years. Pay cash. Why? I'm a tither. 74% of tithers have no credit card payment. And so, actually, I just switched those around. Is 74 have no car payment, 80% have no credit card payment. But let me ask you, isn't that the you want for you? Isn't that what you want for you? So I'm not talking about finances here. I'm really talking about faith. And the kind of faith that will lead you to the kind of success that all of you want. Not just spiritual success, but success in your marriage, in your family, in your business, and in your walk with God. And so in order to do that, I want to take you back in time to the very first tithe of the Bible. If you have a Bible with you, you can follow along in Genesis chapter 14. I mean, this is going way back, and I want to introduce you to a figure named Abraham. He's kind of a big deal. I know you've heard of him. Abraham is not just the father of the faith for Christians. He's also the father of the faith for Jews. And he's also the father of faith for all Muslims. So half of the religious people of the world look to this one man as the father of faith. When Paul writes his magisterial letter to the Romans, chapter 4, he says, we are saved by grace through faith. How many of you would say that? I'm saved by grace through faith. I'm saved by grace through faith. I mean, that is our message to the world, that you don't earn your way to God. It's God's grace to us that we respond to in faith. That is our salvation. This message is not about finances. It is about faith. And I want to go back to the very first time that it was ever mentioned and say this one thing. If you need to tune out for the rest of the message, here's the whole sermon in a single sentence. You ready? Tithing is our faith responding to God's grace. That's all it is. It's our faith responding to God's grace. So we're going to read Genesis 14, beginning in verse 17 through 20. But I want to take a running start at that, because we're introduced in verse 1 to a guy named Kedorlaomer. He was one mean monkey. This guy was a king in what we now call Iraq. And he aligned with three other kings in the area of Iran and Saudi Arabia, the same area of the world that's giving us so much trouble today. And they went on a rampage through Jordan, through Egypt, through Saudi, and through Israel. And they got all the local kings there to pay them tribute money. Basically, it's a bribe. If you pay me this money, I won't kill you. It's an evil thing, and it lasted for 12 years. And then 5 kings in the area of Israel got together and said, enough is enough. He's bankrupted us. We're not paying tribute anymore. Kedorlaomer, you should have been there. He went through the roof. But he can't just attack. He's got to organize the other 3 kings. It takes him a year. And he gathers an army. The Bible never says how many foot soldiers, but it was the 1,000-mile march through enemy territory, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt. How many soldiers would you guess he gathered? My best educated guess, minimum 50,000 soldiers. And he does a scorched earth march for 1,000 miles. It's a loop where he just destroys everything. Walls are knocked down, buildings are burned. Sons are taken as slaves, daughters are taken as concubine, property is taken as plunder. He's made the loop and he's headed back north and almost is out of Israeli territory. He's going back home when one of the POWs escapes. And he makes a beeline down south to Abraham. Now, you in Texas, and in fact, of all people in our country, you understand this better than anybody else. Abraham was a rancher. And not just a farmer, he's a rancher. And he covers hundreds of square miles with tens of thousands of flocks of goat and sheep and cattle. This guy knows how to protect large territories. And he has, we'll just call them Texas Rangers. But they were 318 men. Other people will call them Delta Force or Navy SEALs, but these guys are like, they're bad dudes. They know how to travel great distances and encounter daunting odds of both wild animals and wild bandits. And Abraham gathers his troops, 318, and they're going up against 50,000 soldiers. What are the odds? I mean, I know we're in church, but can I just be honest? Really? That's odds of 100 to 1. Seriously? So just looking at me, I know you would assume that I have been on secret military operations. Why are you laughing? I've never been on one, but I have a friend in the Delta Force. And so I went to him, showed him the biblical text, explained kind of the situation, the geography, and asked him, how realistic is this? Like, did this really happen? Here's his answer, and I quote, "That's what we do." Oh, dude. It's like, it's so manly. I want to eat some beef jerky right now. So I said, all right, give me this strategy. What would you do? And he said, first of all, you need to cover great distances at lightning speed. These 318 could travel the 150 miles to catch up to Chedorlaomer probably in 3 days or less. They were amazing. Second thing you do is you attack at night, which is just what they did. Third thing is you want to blend into your environment, so you need to be camouflaged. This is a heavily wooded area. That is easy. And to make this even more interesting, Abraham grew up under Chedorlaomer. He knows the language. If he teaches his troops some well-turned phrases, he can turn the four armies in on themselves. So, for example, just teach your guys how to say in the native language of Chedorlaomer, you traitor, how dare you turn on these kings? You see? You wake up in the middle of the night and someone is shouting, grab your plunder and run, they're traitors. Grab your plunder and go. They've abandoned us. They've turned on us. All of a sudden, every sword in every tent comes out, and anything that moves is their target. And Abraham's Texas Rangers are standing on the outside just laughing, going, they're killing each other, they're doing our work for us. And suddenly, several soldiers drop their swords in death, and the shields are laying on the ground. The first thing they leave, are the POWs. And each soldier grabs some gold and begins to run. Well, what does Abraham do? First thing he does is releases the POWs, gives them the sword of a dead soldier, and says, those are the guys that captured you. Go get them, tiger. And now the odds suddenly switch in Abraham's favor. The Bible says that it was a bloodbath for 50 miles. And when the sun comes up, Chedorlaomer's troops are mostly dead, a few escape, and Abraham backtracks 50 miles, picking up the plunder, and in one night, his net worth grew exponentially. He is fabulously wealthy. His entourage of carts and donkeys and trains and plunder behind him was probably a mile long as he made his way snaking along the Jordan River in the rift of that part of the country. He arrives in Jericho, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It is actually 1,800 feet below sea level. And if you look to the west, you see these mountains that rise some 4,000 feet overhead. 2,300 feet, there is this city up there above sea level named Salem. Today we call it Jerusalem. And the king comes down, the king who ruled all of the area where Abraham was a farmer, or I'm sorry, not a farmer, but a herdsman. He comes down and meets Abraham. And here's where we pick it up in verse 17. Did I give you enough time to turn there? Okay, good. After Abraham returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. I want to stop there for a minute and make three simple comments. First, Melchizedek. Interesting name, right? It's kind of this mysterious character. Melchizedek is made up of two Hebrew words, Melchi, which means king, Tzedek, which means righteousness. Now, if you didn't know we were in Genesis 14, and you heard me talk about the king of righteousness, who would you assume that I'm talking about? Jesus. Now, Melchizedek isn't Jesus. Or is he? The second word I want to talk about is Salem. In Hebrew, it is shalom. In Arabic, salam. It means peace. Now, if you didn't know we were in Genesis 14, and you just heard me talking about he's the Prince of Peace, who would you assume I'm talking about? Jesus. Well, Melchizedek isn't Jesus. Or is he? Third, he brings out bread and wine. Clearly, Abraham does not need bread or wine. Look at his wealth. He can buy his own bread. He can provide his own wine. When Melchizedek gives Abraham bread and wine, it's not a payment, it is a person. He is giving something from himself. Now, if you didn't know we were in Genesis 14, and I simply said that the king of Jerusalem gave himself in the form of bread and wine, what would you think I'm talking about? Jesus in communion. Now, Melchizedek isn't Jesus. Or is he? Melchizedek is a fascinating figure for me. He's kind of like Santa Claus in our culture. There was a real person named Santa Claus. But over time, his legend is larger by far than his life. And so it is with Melchizedek. And if you were a Jew and just traced Melchizedek through Jewish history, you would find 3 major scrolls written about Melchizedek. One of them was written 2,000 years after Melchizedek died. It was recorded and put in our Bible in Psalm 110. It's a poem singing the virtues of this Messiah. And Jesus quoted this very psalm. I'm going to read just verse 4. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest in the order of Melchizedek, 1000 BC. 1,000 years later, a second scroll was penned by some Jewish monastic in the desert, not far from where this tithe was given. And he wrote about Melchizedek as kind of the Messiah who would save Israel. And then along come the Romans, 70 AD, and they took the scroll and they put it in a pot and they buried the pot in a cave. And it wasn't found from the time of Jesus until 1947. We read the scroll again for the very first time. They're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm not going to take the time to read to you about Melchizedek from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you get the picture. He was a fascinating figure. And about the time that scroll was buried, 70 AD, another scroll was written talking about Melchizedek as Messiah. That scroll made it into the New Testament of our Bible. Hebrews, we call it, chapter 7. Listen to this. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abram returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, then also king of Salem means king of peace. We've already talked about that. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I am fascinated, like with ancient scrolls and divine mysteries. Oh, I love that stuff. But why should you care? I mean, you're just normal people. You walked into church. You didn't expect a lecture on Melchizedek. Why should you care? Because right now, where you're seated, you are standing in the very same spot as Abraham with Melchizedek. And I don't know if Melchizedek was really Jesus or he was a shadow or a figure. I don't really care. Here's what I know. Abraham, who is the father of our faith, responded to this figure of God's man, God's Messiah, God's king. And he didn't just bow, he gave a tithe to him because that was the right way of putting into perspective his recent victory. You were in the exact same spot as Abraham because all of you have some level of victory right now. God's given you freedom in this nation. He's given you a Bible in your hand. He's given you a church to attend in a very comfortable environment. He's given you salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ our Lord. What, pray tell, will you do with that grace? Abraham, if you've ever said, I'm saved by grace through faith, then you should ask, what does the faith of Abraham look like in my life? Can we read verse 19 together? And he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to the God Most High who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Why? It really goes back to this illustration. He wasn't giving him a tip to say thank you. He was giving God a tithe to pledge allegiance to him. And I want to show you how critical that is. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but if I did, I wonder how many of you had ever heard of Melchizedek before, who had ever actually looked at his life or studied him at all. A few, but not a lot. Chedorlaomer would even be fewer people. Why do we not know about Abraham's great victory over Chedorlaomer? He alone, with 318 Texas Rangers, conquered 4 major kings of the Middle East. Why do we not talk about that? Because that's not the greatest thing to talk about with Abraham. You know what the greatest thing is? Not chapter 14, chapter 15. God comes to Abraham and he says, "I want to give a covenant to you so that through you every nation on earth would be blessed." And lo and behold, here we sit, 2017. We are blessed because of Abraham's faith thousands of miles away. In chapter 17, Abraham said to God, "I'm yours, my people are yours, my family is yours." So God says, "All right, I want you to mark your family as different from every other nation." And they did that physically through circumcision. You've heard about circumcision. I'm not going to talk about that. But you've heard about it. Why? Because it was a marker in his life for allegiance to God. You look at chapter 20 in this book. In chapter 20 and 21 is the story of Isaac being born in Abraham's old age. And we'll go, wow, what faith. The faith of Abraham to trust in God for a son. Chapter 22, God says, take that son, the one I gave you in old age, that miraculous intervention, and I want you to put him on an altar and I want you to kill him. And Abraham got clear to the point where his hand was raised with a knife going straight to his son's chest. And an angel of God stopped him. You've heard that story, right? Here's the point. Every major victory of Abraham's life came after the tithe, when he recognized allegiance to God for the gifts that he had given him. And I already told you, you're sitting right now, you are in Genesis 14 spot in your life. God has given you so much. The question, what are you going to do with it? And you think, well, you know, I'm going to thank God for giving me my family. I'm going to thank God for giving me the Bible. I'm going to thank God for giving me my job. No, look, tips are good. In fact, Christians are better tippers than anyone else. Christians give 4 times more to benevolent organizations than non-Christians do. Tipping is good. Anyone who's raised a child knows that appreciation, you want your kids to be appreciative. And it's good for you to tip the church because you're saying to God, thank you for what you've given me. But if that's all you do, it will never take you to the place of spiritual growth that you want for you. And if you want to be an extraordinary faithful person, an extraordinary believer with extraordinary faith and do extraordinary things for God, then you have to get past chapter 14 with your own giving of allegiance to God through tithes. And look, folks, it's not just about you. This is not just a mega church. This is a giga church. You're big, and you have influence all over this city. But if you looked at it from God's perspective, you are a speck in a sea of lost people. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area alone, there are millions of souls heading to a Christless eternity. You have bigger battles to face. You have bigger opportunities than you can imagine. And it will stem for whether you give appreciation or whether you give God full allegiance. The tithe is not about the money. It's not about the percentage. It's not about giving so that the church has the resources for a big PR campaign. It is about you showing allegiance to God so that he can give you greater victories than you ever imagined possible. And what's weighing in the balance is not just your personal spiritual success, But this area of Texas, the state, the country, the nation, and ultimately the world is dependent on believers to show allegiance to God, not just appreciation to God. What are you going to do with the victory that God has given you? You might think where you are is a big deal. You ain't seen nothing yet. Will you show God allegiance for the sake of the lost? So my takeaway today is really simple. It's really simple. Tithe or pray. Tithe or pray. Now, I don't mean do either one because they're both equal. I'm saying if you're tithing, keep tithing. If you're not tithing, pray about tithing. Not whether you should, but how you can. And I would like to ask everyone in here who does not tithe, I mean, this is an issue of faith, being saved by grace through faith. This is an issue of faith, not finances. Just ask God, set a timer on your phone, set a timer on your watch for 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. every day. 10 a.m. every day, it will represent 10% of the tithe. And every time it goes off, this prayer is so simple you could do it while you're driving a car. Here it is. God, is it time to tithe? I want to ask you to do that for 14 days. And I promise you, He will give you an answer in 14 days. Is it time to tithe? Because if you do, your future successes will trump any success you've ever had heretofore. And a waiting world is hoping that the people of God will show allegiance over appreciation. Let's pray.